All right, we're going to be shifting gears for the next little while and get into some of the more esoteric softness kind of areas that we've been hinting at. So as you guys sit down, our first speaker, there's a schedule change because of an airplane change or something. I don't know what the hell, but he's, at any rate, the gentleman, Chris Paul, two first names from Rand, and we're very honored that he was able to come down. And then we're going to be moving into some of the softer, hopefully crazier areas as well, the things that may generate some political disruption in here, because we need some stuff that's a little different. So with that, Chris Paul, thank you.
Thanks very much. Glad to be here. This is my second InfowarCon. I spoke at a big one in Maryland in 2009, but I'm glad to be back. I'll apologize in advance. My briefing is mostly text and doesn't have a lot of fun, sexy pictures. So I guess I'll try to dance around and be animated and keep the topic engaging in that way.
My Little Pony. Here's all you need.
I have no ponies. I apologize. Nor mercifully any hippo butts.
Because I'm trying to get out of this.
What I do have is a study that we finished up last year that was sponsored by the Department of Defense on assessment. Assessment for efforts to inform, influence, and persuade. We use that turn of phrase rather than saying information operations or psychological operations or military information support operations or strategic communication or any of the other possible terms of art, because it's potentially broad and will be enduring as some terms of art go away. But the problem is simple. The Department of Defense spends a lot of money every year on efforts to inform, influence, and persuade, and Congress has finally started to pay attention to that and wants to know what they are getting for their money. So in this evaluation or assessment space are a number of challenges. Challenges about causal conflation, challenges about the difficulty of aggregating across a campaign. If you do 8 different things and you get the results you're looking for, which of those things contributed what portion? There's the fact that influencing takes time. So in a Department of Defense assessment culture that has a foundation in battle damage assessment, where after a sortie is flown or some kind of strike is delivered, you go and look at it, and if it's smoking, then you check the box, did it. Whereas if you deliver influence messages, a series of influence messages, it may take weeks or months or even longer before you actually see your effects. So what we were asked to do and what we set out to do was look at existing practice, both in our Department of Defense, in other departments of defense, and in industry and in academia, in marketing, in social marketing, in academic evaluation research. We talked to over 100 subject matter experts across a wide range of fields, talking about effective assessment and evaluation in efforts to sell, influence, persuade, coerce, etc., and identify some best practices. Oops. So the good news is our reports were finally published last week. Here is the main volume, the desk reference. There's also a practitioner's handbook, about 100 pages, which is a little more nimble. Unlike most RAND publications, this actually has an index, something I requested and was able to get added there. Because we're RAND and part of our mission is dissemination of findings, you can get the PDFs for free off these web pages.
Wow.
So I'm not trying to sell the book, even if you do end up buying a hard copy because it's handy. I don't see any of that money. It's just I'm happy to have it out there and available to practitioners in the community. So in the reports, we cover 10 major topic areas. Because I'm only going to talk to you for about half an hour with 15 minutes for questions, I'm only going to talk deeply about the first 4 things. But I'm happy to take questions on any of them or just hand you the book and tell you to look it up yourself. One of the things that's important in this space is motivating assessment. Why? Let's take a step back. Why do we want to do evaluation or assessment? In the literature, there are basically 3 reasons. Either you're doing formative evaluation, which helps you with your planning, helps you figure out what it is that you need to do to make your effort succeed, or we do process evaluation. Am I actually doing what I set out to do? Are the contracts being delivered? Is whatever persuasive messages or actions I set out to undertake, are they happening with the desired frequency? Are they being received in the way that I expected that they would? And then finally, the summative evaluation. Did it work? Did what I wanted to happen actually happen? So there's a lot of different reasons given for assessment or evaluation, and in the report we list 20 or 30. All of them can be binned into one of these three categories. So if it's accountability, accountability is usually a summative evaluation, and that's something that's important. Another principle of assessment: assessment should support decision making. Formative assessment helps you decide what to include or exclude in your plan. Process decision-making helps you identify whether there are changes that need to be made in the process, helps you decide whether to keep doing what you're doing or whether you need to change vendors or go turn the screws on some of your team members to make sure they're actually doing what needs to be done. Summative evaluation helps you make future decisions. Gee, that program worked really well. I want to do another one like that. Gee, that program didn't work really well. If I can figure out why, the next time I can make it better. Gee, that program didn't work really well, and I figured out that it was because it was a bad program. I'm not going to do that one anymore. But it should always support decision making. Unfortunately, too often, we hear anecdotes about commanders asking for assessments or other kind of stakeholders asking for assessments that aren't for good reasons. Assessments that are just for curiosity, kind of divorced from any decisions. So it's not okay to request assessments to support a decision you've already made. That's just a waste of money. And it's not okay to ask for assessment because you're curious. If you have some kind of decision that the curiosity might inform, fine, go ahead. So as I mentioned, one of the motivations for this study was increased congressional scrutiny on Department of Defense inform, influence, and persuade programs. So one of the things that we did was talk to some of the congressional stakeholders, talk to congressional staff, and say, why? What is it that you really want to know? What are you getting now? What would you like to get? Why? What decisions do you need to support, and in what ways? And talking to congressional staff, fundamentally, their assessment requirement is about accountability. It's about what is the money getting spent on? What are we getting for that money? But within that broader accountability request, there's several different desires. One of them is a desire for standardization, which is a bit of a slippery desire, but they'd like to see a lot of these things talked about in the same way. They'd also like to see improving assessments transitioning from output focused. What did you get? I got 20,000 leaflets. I got 16 hours of radio commercial content on these three stations. Those are outputs to outcomes. What did you actually get? I got a 1.3% shift on the latest Zogby poll. I got 17,000 people to turn out to vote in a town where previously only 3,000 people had turned out to vote. What did you get? What are the outcomes? They'd like to see that sort of thing. And they'd like to see more reflexive admission of what has and hasn't worked. Gee, we've got more than a decade of experience doing inform, influence, and persuade operations in combat environments. Some of those things, especially in the early days of free-flowing money, weren't very effective. Can we admit that some of those things weren't very effective? Do some post hoc assessment and evaluation of why they weren't effective so that in the future we can avoid wasting money and be more likely to spend our money efficiently. One of the big challenges there, and something that even in those early conversations with these stakeholders is clear, was problems with the idea of standardization. When we talk to congressional stakeholders about other kinds of military capabilities, they don't ask for standardization. No sensible congressional staffer would ever ask for standard metrics with which to compare a carrier battle group and an infantry battalion. These are both force projection assets, but they just don't have metrics in common. Everybody understands that under the rubric of military force, they fit under that umbrella, but they have very different roles. They have very different contexts of application. There's lots of things that are different about them. Why, then, Would you ask for things that inform, influence, and persuade, which can be as diverse and different in their style, application, and format? Why would you ask to standardize those things? Well, there's a reason, and the reason is the lack of shared understanding. Even someone, a congressional staffer who hasn't served, who doesn't have a lot of military experience, still has some kind of shared understanding of what a carrier battle group might do and what an infantry battalion might do. But that shared understanding does not extend to most information inform, influence, and persuade capabilities. Imagine a psychological operations or military information support operations detachment. What can they do? Well, okay, if you get into it, there's a list of things that they can do, but most people don't have an intuition of that. More importantly, even if you get down to some of the popular things that they can do, like arrange a leaflet drop. Well, we all have an intuition of how fires works. We know that if there's a bridge and we want it to be destroyed, if you direct enough fire at the bridge will fail. What about with leaflets? What's the intuition there? We don't know how many leaflets we need to drop. We don't know how long that's going to take. And of course, if you drop leaflets on a bridge, that doesn't really do anything. So this lack of shared understanding pushes towards this desire for standardization. Help us understand without really understanding what the initial deficiency is. Now, on the defense side of the equation, the Department of Defense would like to be able to serve this accountability requirement. And in fact, in an era of constrained budgets, they'd like to be able to manage that for themselves. But there's a second purpose for assessment on the Department of Defense side, and that's process improvement. How can we make the things we're doing better? There's often things that are working to some extent, but with some feedback from effective evaluation, could work better. So those are the main sets of requirements in this space. Yeah.
Without naming names, although I do know her name.
No, I didn't get to talk to her.
But you know who I'm talking about.
I know who you're talking about.
And I understand that she's the one who's behind the movement for this accountability beyond, I mean, assessment beyond accountability. But I understand her motivation is because of where her husband works.
It's not just her. There are other congressional staff and there are congresspersons who want to see better assessment. But I think more of them are inclined to be satisfied by improving and reasonable assessments. Whereas because in politics, some people have a political agenda and they may say one thing, hey, I want better assessment, when in fact, what they want is the Department of Defense to get out of the influence business, which is a different issue. And again, I haven't spoken with who we're talking about, so I don't know her side of the story. Yeah.
Will you be talking all about best practices and influence operations several time zones away in different languages for people who generally don't have friends with?
No, and in fact, I'm not going to talk about best practices for influence at all. I'm going to talk about best practices for assessment.
I'm sorry.
So the practice. So to be clear, what this is about, although the underlying subject is how do you influence better, this is really just about how do you do assessment in this space. What are some of the options? What are some of the best practices, so that can help you do that better without ever touching on the underlying psychology, which modes or approaches are more effective, what the different context issues are. So moving right along. The second major section in the studies is about distilling some core principles. And these were things that, given that we were in multiple sectors, again, we're looking in defense, we're looking elsewhere in government, we're looking in industry, in marketing, we're looking in industry, in public communication, social marketing, kind of smoking cessation campaigns, that kinds of things. What things did these sectors all have in common?
Is civilian marketing directly equivalent?
Absolutely not. It is absolutely not. Do I have that on another slide? No. So I'll tell you now. So the best analogy. So that's a great question. So you look at these different things. Sometimes you see good practice, or you recognize something as strong practice, but it may not be directly applicable. Commercial marketing is not a particularly good analogy for a couple of reasons. First, in civilian marketing, all the assessments all have a dollar sign at the end of the rainbow, because unsurprisingly, commercial firms are interested in making money. In the Department of Defense context, we are not interested in making money. Mismatch. Second, in commercial marketing, you're trying to sell your product to people who want a product like it. In defense, we're trying to influence people who we may have a hard time reaching and who may not want what we're saying.
But sure, that's just negative money.
Well, you could think of it that way. But anyway, so the analogy starts to break down. Where the best analogy was, where we found the best pockets of good practice with good reason to believe it was applicable in the defense context, was in the intersection of public communication and evaluation research. So campaigns like a gambling cessation campaign, or a smoking cessation campaign, or a road safety campaign. The analogy there is good because the outcome is behavioral. They're not interested in money. They're interested in being efficient with their money, but they're not interested in making money. They're interested in changing behavior, and they're often addressing audiences who aren't particularly interested in that behavioral change. They don't want what's being sold. Many people who are smoking like smoking. Teen sexual behavior. Many teens are happy with their sexual behavior. They don't want to constrain that or curtail that or change that. So that kind of campaign, coupled with best practice from academic evaluation research, some really great stuff. But in this section,
Doesn't that potentially trap you into being the lecturing nanny state of the IO world?
well, the effective public communication campaigns are not lecturing nanny campaigns. So as any time you're making an analogy, you have to watch to make sure that your predicates are sound. But those predicates, behavior change and not being concerned about money, pretty good analogy. And the one about audience, not an audience that is going to naturally come to you, an audience that may be hard to reach or hard to identify or hard to influence. So principles from all sectors that we saw again and again and again, maybe talked about with different language, but that were unambiguous consensus of assessment and evaluation principles applicable in this domain. Summarize some of those. First, in order to do effective assessment, you need to have clear, realistic, and measurable goals. It all starts at the top with goals and objectives. If you don't have a clear objective in mind, it's really hard for any assessor to tell you whether or not you've accomplished it. It seems self-evident, but time and again, we either set out with ambiguous goals and then never refine them, or have goals that are too airy-fairy and high and strategic sounding that they can't actually be observed in any way. And if you don't have something clear in mind, you can't determine whether you've accomplished it. You can't talk about incremental progress. There's some suggestions later for how to improve on that. Second, assessment starts in planning. Assessment can't be an afterthought. You should plan your assessment when you're planning your plan. And in fact, you should plan your plan with assessment providing inputs along the way so that you can improve it as you're executing. Yeah.
So I'm assuming that implies that you have to somehow do baseline assessments at the beginning before you've started any operation.
Yeah, that's one of the other things I'm going to say is that measuring change requires a baseline. And it's possible, but hard and methodologically fraught to construct a post hoc baseline. And so much easier to take a baseline measure at the outset.
in order to assess or to detect an influence operation against your own population.
The idea of a theory of change or something
Well,
else?
just kind of generally the way you're going about assessing the effectiveness of your own IIP program. Could it be used some way? Could it be modified in some way to detect influence operations being waged upon our own population?
Maybe. I haven't thought about that in detail. That's an interesting question. You have a thought?
So I'd just like to have more conversation about it.
Okay.
later. So,
It just sounds like your program is planned toward an assessment of a particular program, not detection of
Correct.
another program.
But
Not that it couldn't be done.
right, so there may be some insights from this that would be useful in that paradigm, but you're absolutely correct. What I set up to structure here is, hey, we're doing something, we want to plan it for maximum effectiveness, make sure that it's executed in accordance with its design, and then figure out whether it worked or not,
Build in security, build in testing, build in assessment.
whatever it happens to be.
One of the areas, I really like the way you're laying this out. One of the areas though I have a real serious challenge with some of the equivalency. So, I mean, even with physics, right, we have a munitions effectiveness testing board to go blow things up and see where our assumptions do not match reality when we have a new warhead design, et cetera. We have cyber range, so we have some limited munitions effectiveness activity. We won't talk much about that, but we have nothing equivalent for soft IO. And I, having faced that problem, we are vulnerable to basically any social scientist with a psychological theory showing up in a briefing and blowing an entire program out of the water because we don't have a way to evaluate ground truth of our theories of change.
So two thoughts about that. One is we need to build that corpus, and good assessment is a way to do it. So following this idea of a theory of change, you can try out a theory of change as a hypothesis, even if it's one that some PhD somewhere would die on the cross in support of because they really believe it. Well, you have it as a hypothesis. If it works, then you validated it in that context. So we need to start doing this and collecting the corpus of what has and has not worked. We also have to recognize that the vast majority of our understanding of the basic psychology of persuasion comes from experiments done on American university students. Well, the rest of the world may not cognate exactly like American university students. So there's a need for some foundational research. Hey, let's see if persuasion works the same in some countries of interest. But yeah, you're always going to be vulnerable to the naysayer. So you set up what you believe, what your commander believes, what your subject matter experts believe, and you should always lay it out as a theory of change, as a hypothesis. And you should always seek to validate it in context. And until we've done that some more, it's going to be harder. It's always going to be a hypothesis.
Well, not only that, the way people cognate changes as a society gets different ideas. So it's going to be very difficult to keep it updated, even if you get a snapshot of time, right?
Right.
You'd have to cross-reference it by culture and ideas that people hold, and not just geographic region.
Luckily, assessment is iterative. But just because your program works once in a place doesn't mean that if you keep doing that same thing, it's going to work more. It may be that if your target is 60% of something and your program carries you up to 45%, you may need a different mode of persuasion to carry it the last 15%. So assessment has to be iterative. And that means both repeated measures over time, because that's really the only way you can see trend lines, and more reflexive recognition that change in your theory of change may be necessary, or change in your assessment approach may be necessary.
So, I mean, kind of maybe tangent and maybe getting ahead of it, is will you get into models for measuring the efficacy of campaigns or assessments or?
Yes, in much greater detail in the reports than I can get into here. But there's an appendix in the report that lists a bunch of existing psychological theories of persuasion that can become part of a theory of change, and a whole lot of methodological information about, no kidding, how do you, in certain contexts, build an assessment framework to measure your outcomes. So this is going to kind of wave tops and skim above that, but we could talk more about that as that's interesting. And if there were more time, I'd suggest that we pick an example and kind of talk through things that we could do. But let's see what I get to and how much time we have left. Finally, on this slide, assessment isn't free. General rule of thumb, and there's a lot of variation on this, is at about 5%. You should spend about 5% of whatever your total budget is on assessment and evaluation. That varies, of course, and it's, if you're spending a small amount, then it's probably not going to be sufficient. Another key insight is that some assessment is better than no assessment, and that not everything needs to be assessed equally. And I think this is really potentially useful for the Department of Defense. So 2 examples. One, at one of the combatant commands, they're doing a host of inform, influence, and persuade engagements at the national level, and sometimes as a country with which we have almost no engagement. So any kind of engagement, any kind of foot in the door is a success. There are other countries with whom we have much more robust engagement where we actually have persuasion goals. There's something we're trying to accomplish. These 2 categories of countries need to be assessed, and activities with them need to be assessed very differently. If you have an actual goal, then you want to measure progress towards that goal. If you're just trying to get your foot in the door, then yeah, any engagement is successful, and you don't need to spend a lot of extra money documenting that. The trick is finding the transition point. When have you gotten your foot in the door so many times that it's time to start setting some objectives and actually measuring them? Another insight, if you're doing the same program in 4 different provinces in a single country, and there's a great deal of cultural homogeneity in that country, how should you spend your assessment dollars? Should you salami slice it and measure each of the 4 equally, but poorly? That's one possibility. My argument would be that you would be better served doing really good assessment in one province and do kind of minimal collection of measures of performance or maybe some outcomes data in the other provinces. And if you then argue that if it worked well in one province, and there are positive indicators in the other provinces, that you've done good assessment. Now, over time, because assessment is iterative, you should rotate which province is getting the premium treatment to validate that. But that you don't have to, good assessment does not mean equality of assessment. So, moving on to other things. Oh, organizing for assessment. This is something that's really of interest in the community. What are the good practices for how we organize for assessment? One big takeaway is that we find that you really have to integrate your assessment processes within routine processes. You can't have either the inform, influence, and persuade activities or the assessment activities being something outside the normal staff hierarchy, outside the normal process. It has to be part of your routine way of doing business. That said, you run up against this taken for granted problems again. So if you put influence assessment inside your normal assessment process, you run into this problem that the traditional assessment, the battle damage assessment, has all these assumptions, has all these taken for granted. So within that process, you have to figure out, where do we unpack the taken for granted? Okay, sure, we can leave everyone's intuition that if you drop enough ordnance on a bridge, it fails. But we have to unpack that a little bit so we can explain why we think our inform, influence, and persuade effort is going to result in what kinds of behavior changes and spell out our theory of change. But if we do that, we can fit that within the normal assessment scheme. Second, we have some bad precedent to overcome. There's been a lot of failed assessment. And in order to break out of that cycle, we need some commanders to give assessment a second chance. And we need better doctrine and supporting advice. We need some better training. We need some better access to expertise, and show some pockets of better practice. A further assessment really hinges on leadership. If commanders, if leaders are committed to getting good assessments, if they're committed to making decisions based on assessments rather than their own intuition, and if they're getting quality assessments that support their intuition or or surpass their intuition, then they can get what they need. If assessment is important to a commander and he or she makes that clear, his or her subordinates will value assessment and perhaps find ways to execute it better. And again, it's not only a general principle, but it's about organizing. Assessment has to start in planning. When you start the staff process for planning, have assessment bubbles in there too. Should be part of the process. And you need to avoid over-optimism. There's lots of different ways to do informal assessments or to interpret assessment results that result in inappropriate optimism. One way to prevent that is not, and this is something beyond just red teaming. This is formalized devil's advocacy, having someone in the staff whose job is to look at any given assessment and to interpret it in the worst possible way. And in fact, it's not a bad idea to publish, and I mean publish in the loosest sense, however the assessment's going to be distributed in a briefing, in a white paper, verbally, to include the devil's advocate position in that. Say, here are the data, here is the commander's assessment, the commander's interpretation of the data, but here's a devil's advocate interpretation of the data. Here's the worst possible interpretation of what that might mean. Just so it helps give you, in a squishier space of qualitative assessments, some kind of bounds, some kind of left and right bounds of what's likely to be true or what's not. So coming back to determining what's worth measuring, how do you decide what to collect data on? There's a lot of disagreement about what to measure. There's the danger of metric creep, where you collect entirely too much information. There's also the danger of collecting what's easy rather than what's important. So figuring out what to measure is an important part of the process. Fundamentally, it's got to be about objectives. What are you trying to accomplish? Can you find a way to measure that? So setting good objectives, and good in this space usually means target behaviors. What is it that you want an audience that you're trying to inform, influence, or persuade to do differently? And how does that connect to your overall campaign objective? If you can get to that point, it's almost easy after that. It's not necessarily trivial to get to that point. Because often we talk about ambiguous goals, like we want to increase legitimacy. Okay, yes, we do, and we can see how legitimacy could support a broader campaign goal. Fine, what then are the observable behaviors of increasing legitimacy? What is legitimacy enhancing behavior? That may be different in context, that may be different at different levels. The easy one to go to is participation in election. Or are there other kinds of participation in governments? Are there other kinds of participation or respect for various different components of a government that can be observed? What can you observe? There's a debate within the community between the acceptability of attitudinal objectives vice behavioral objectives. While we recognize that debate, we don't have a firm stance other than to say that most of the time, at the end of the day, behavioral is what you want to get to. But somewhere along your theory of change, there may be some attitudinal objectives. And that's okay to have some attitudinal things in there, as long as you get where you want to go eventually.
Can you be a little more detailed in what the difference would be?
So an attitudinal objective might be target audience is supportive of local government. So supportive of is attitudinal. That's an easy one to fix. Target audience demonstrates supportive behavior, demonstrates support for local government, and then list what you mean by support for. And is that showing up to vote? Is that attendance at representative councils or shuras or town council meetings? Is that a certain number of tips provided about criminal or militant activity to the local government? What do you think the behaviors that are associated with that? And again, if you stop and think, most of the time you can figure that out. What do you really want? So pushing towards behaviors rather than attitudes helps protect against sloppy thinking.
So to give a specific example, then I can't breathe versus throw rocks at the police, right? In Baltimore, the thing that's going on right now with the Baltimore riots, and the Ferguson issues and all of these things that are affecting public perception of law enforcement, vice actually inciting riot, which is what seems to be happening at the moment. So one is an attitudinal change.
Right.
The other is specifically influencing behavior.
Right. So if to take it out of the U.S. context, if we were going to act as agents provocateur and wanted to inspire Ukrainian citizens to riot against the Russian occupiers, the behaviors, so the attitudes we might want would be opposition to occupation. But if there are specific things that we want to do as a consequence of those attitudes, what do we want? Well, if there's another referendum or election or something, we want them to vote in it and vote in a certain way. If there's opportunities
Boycott
to,
a non-representative process.
right, so yeah, and we might want them to boycott something. We might want them to participate in online forum discussions in defense of their homeland. We might want them to show up for some kind of demonstration. We might want them to dress a certain way when they do to show solidarity. Have everyone wear blue as the color of Ukraine or something. So if we break out the specific things, so if our overall theory of change involves increased indigenous rejection of the occupation, then we can spell out specific things that we want them to do to demonstrate that. And attitudinal shift might be a piece of our overall theory of change. So that's why I don't come down as hard on attitudes as some do, as long as it connects logically. The things you want people to do and how you hope to get them to do that and what your ultimate military objective is.
So measuring political jokes is off the table.
Maybe, maybe not. And again, so as part of an overall campaign, if your theory of change is humor helps uncement attitudes and makes people reflective. People who are reflective can then be persuaded, here's our persuasions and here's what it's going to lead to. If you articulate your theory of change like that, then that might have a place in that. And with good assessment, it's testable. Something else to think about when setting up objectives. Good objectives, well-articulated objectives, need to make clear both what success and failure would look like. Ideally, some kind of clear target threshold for success. So you don't have a small change in the amount or frequency of a behavior that's actually within the margin of error on however you're measuring it, but you say, well, it seems like it's working, so we're going to keep doing it. Some kind of time threshold. How long do you have until you meet this threshold for this objective? And then it really helps if you break your objective into small incremental chunks. So if you have a theory of change that has lots of little incremental hops, then that helps you lay out a timeline. It helps you show incremental projects, because oftentimes we're talking about big changes, especially when we're talking about changes in things that are related to legitimacy. That can take quite a while to show itself. But if you have small incremental steps along the way, then you don't have to wait until the very end to find out that it hasn't worked. You can get some. One of the other principles we espouse is fail fast. Especially in this squishy space of inform, influence, and persuade, where you're not really sure that what you're doing is gonna work. Figure out how to do it as quickly as possible and get some early measurements as quickly as possible to see if your theory of change seems to be working, so that you can then course correct and either adjust your theory of change or adjust your application so you can move forward and find something that does work.
So we talked briefly about this Tuesday night. I think it's worth sharing again. When we were talking about this, from the more in-depth things that I've seen, this is the same type of assessments and goals that you would use to build any type of system, a technological system, a socio-technical system, a political technical system. So I see that there are lots of parallels in the exact same techniques, such as defining your KPPs, is what we call it in the systems engineering world. And then you mentioned just now fail fast, which is what agile preaches, right? So I totally see how systemic modeling could play a total role in doing the assessments of where you could war game out a lot of these types of things and know how your outcomes and what your best options are. Is that something that people are talking about doing?
Yeah, absolutely. The challenge being the transition from the physical, where it's easy to have shared assumptions that are correct, and the squishier psychological space where there's a lot more uncertainty. But provided that you lay out your systems diagram, and instead of claiming it as certain, recognize that this is how we think this system works, but we're not sure about the assumption at this node, we're not sure about the assumption at this node, so we really have to collect measures on those going forward to make sure that we validate this diagram.
Sure.
Yeah.
So nearly identical thought, but a lot of these requirements you would say were part of any sort of good project management, I guess,
definition of what are your criteria, are there specific criteria, unique criteria to this IIP type problem compared to?
So the vast majority of what we find is applicable across assessment or evaluation in any space. Where there are things that are IIP distinctive, we try to call them out. The biggest one is the lack of shared understandings. And then the second biggest one is the uncertainty, the inherent uncertainty and timelines involved in psychological processes. I think I'm running low on time, so if you'll bear with me for just a moment, I will zoom through some slides and then we can have free-wheeling discussion until Wynn waves me off.
It's all my fault.
So we've already talked a bunch about theories of change, but so I guess another key takeaway from this, if you'll bear with me, another key takeaway is that assessment, if everything goes well, assessment doesn't help you that much. If you get what you want, then all you really needed to do was measure your results. And you go, oh, I got my results. Assessment is most valuable when you don't get what you want, and it helps you figure out why. So that's when you really need to have articulated a theory of change. You really need to have taken some kind of measurements of critical intervening nodes, so that if at the end or at some midpoint, you can look and say, hey, here's our theory of change, here's the outcome we're getting towards, no movement on that outcome. Why? Why are things not going the way we want to? If you've measured some intervening things, you may be able to fix that going along. You may be able to look at the nodes you've measured and say, oh, hey, gee, we're out there, all our messages are getting delivered. Oh, but they're not getting received. Hey, let's do a focus group. Oh, it turns out at the time that our program is on, everyone is watching their favorite game show on a different channel. This is an easy fix. We need to move our time slot. By different air time and take a measure next week. Hey, now things are moving. Now I've made a mid-course correction. Now assessment has helped me out. Other stuff. So here's one of the other things that's in here is an evaluation of the evaluation. One of the things requested by one of the stakeholders for the report. Hey, how can we assess our assessments? So we gave a quick checklist. And it's pretty simple, yes, partially, or no. And anywhere you check no, you need to offer an explanation for why that isn't present in your assessment. Because there may be perfectly good extenuating reasons for that to not be present. Another big point I want to make. One of the things that's often treated as a bugbear in this space is causation. People wring their hands and go, oh, I can't show that what I did caused the results that occurred. Even if there's a clear logical argument to be made, I can't do randomized controlled field experiments, so I can't get to causation. My response to that is, well, if causation is that important to you, and you design your assessment from the outset, you can get to causation, and it's not that hard. My favorite example would be, because again, the kinds of things, so you need some kind of control. In order to make a causal claim, you need to have a control group. And often in the defense context, that's a non-starter. We want to do our thing to everybody. We don't want to leave anybody out. Well, to get a design, one of many designs that can get you to causation, starts with delayed release in some areas. So imagine that you're going to persuade everyone within a province to adopt the behavior that you want. Well, divide your province in half in some sensible way and deliver your so measure, take a baseline measure across the whole province, deliver your intervention in your half of the province, measure again across the whole province, and then begin delivering your intervention in both parts of the province. So you have two groups, one group that got the intervention late and one group that's had it the whole time, and you've got a couple measurement points, and so any difference between the two is very strongly attributable to your cause. So that's some trouble. You have to plan for it, but it's not that much extra expensive, and if causation is really important to you, you can get there. So we have a bunch of recommendations for a number of different communities, and I'll bang through those real quickly. For those who are actually doing assessments, the four bubbas who show up and get assigned this task, push back, require SMART, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound objectives. Sometimes this requires leading up. So if you roll in on something and you're asked to assess it, and the objectives don't have those qualities, then you can ask, hey, Commander, sir, can you refine that objective for me? But that's probably not going to work so well. So the better response would be to say, okay, I'm going to design my own reinterpretation of that objective. And I'm going to push that back up the chain of command and say, well, sir, to do assessment, I need a more precisely specified objective. Here's my specification. Is that okay? That will either result in whoever's higher up saying, yeah, that's close enough, that's good, move on that. Or they'll disagree in some way, and the information they provide in disagreeing will help you refine it and get to the smart objectives. Second, be explicit about theories of change. Don't assume anything in this space. Make it clear what you're assuming. Spell out your theory of change. And there's a slide I passed about getting the right balance on a theory of change. If you're not careful, you can end up with something really sloppy and complicated, like the infamous spaghetti diagram. That's the one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is what the old South Park episode about the underpants gnomes, where you do this and profit. Okay, if it's too simple, that's too simple. So there's some art to this science. You have to find the right degree of complexity. You have to identify what the vulnerable nodes are. Some assumptions are pretty safe, and you can say, I'm pretty sure it works that way. That one, I'm not so sure. In this context, I'm not sure that works that way. I'm going to watch that one closely. Then, of course, resource assessment. Make sure that you actually have the necessary man hours and contractor dollars and whatever else you need. And finally, think about your stakeholders. When you go to present your assessment, assessment isn't just about doing good science, it's about selling good science. So match your design. Do I need causation? If so, plan for it from the outset. Match your design and your presentation to the uses and the users that assessment's going to be put to. The next layer, the broader defense, inform, influence, and persuade community. Hey, let's get assessment in doctrine. Let's get better guidance in the doctrine. Let's get more training. Let's get more expertise. Let's get better advocacy for this. And this should be self-perpetuating. As we start to receive the benefits of good assessment, more commanders and senior leaders are going to want more of that. Let's establish some common assessment standards while recognizing that not everything needs to be assessed to the same standard. And let's do more formative research. Coming back to your question about applicability of these things in different contexts. Let's do some baselines. Let's figure out, hey, are people in the Philippines persuaded the same way that American college students are? This is an empirical question. This is testable in open source collaboration with university research. So let's do more and better target audience analysis in places where we are operating or where we might operating. Let's fail fast. Let's set up to do more pilot testing, kind of quick burn little things to see if something works the way we want before we ramp it up to a larger scale. And let's try some different things and learn from them. So also in the broader community, let's change how we require assessment. Put it in the orders. Anybody who's worn a uniform knows that if you're ordered to do something, you're more likely to do it than if you're asked to do something. So let's get it in the orders. And wouldn't it be great if there was some kind of place to look for existing measures and metrics in this space that showed where they were used and whether they worked or not? The list of things that didn't work would almost be as useful as the list of things that did work. Because you could go and say, okay, I'm thinking of measuring this. Oh, gee, a bunch of people measured that on a different detachment somewhere else, and it totally didn't work for these 3 reasons. Okay, that's a bad one. Now let me look at the good ones. Let me find some ones that did work. It'd be nice if someone would consolidate
everything we measure would have wound up on that list in one context or another at a different point.
So maybe at some point you have someone scrub it and kind of say, okay, this one failed because of these things. If you don't have that in your context, you can move back to the good list. But that'd be a nice problem to have if you actually consolidated them and had some disagreements rather than not having it at all.
So wouldn't it be also nice if you were to measure what, in a classified context, if you were to measure what other people were potentially doing,
Oh, absolutely.
how successful they were?
Sure. Yeah, coming back to did you move where you're sitting? Anyway.
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
Sorry.
No worries. Yeah, that
The other guy in the white
Yeah,
shirt.
the other guy in the white shirt was sitting over there. Looks exactly like me.
yeah, it would absolutely be useful if you recognize that an adversary or opponent is also, because that's when we talk about this in the broader space, one of the things that you should put in your theory of change is in many defense environments, we're not the only player. There's various ostensibly neutral forces, or there may be hostile forces that are also trying to influence the population. So that could be a node in your theory of change. Gee, this theory should lead to my target audience doing more of what I want unless someone else is persuading them to do less of what I want. So then it becomes important, okay, now I want to see what they're trying to accomplish. I want to monitor their progress towards their objectives, unless their objectives don't disagree with mine, because we have different theories of how this conflict is going to unfold. But yeah, certainly some of these same kinds of logics could be used could and should be used to monitor what somebody else is doing in space.
And I absolutely agree with that, but what is likely to successful reception of the brief that says, hey, we've just spent X millions of dollars on this program and we can show no effect because during this time adversary, night letters increased by 50% and kidnappings for tribal leaders did X. I mean, that's not a really persuasive message for why I failed at my mission.
No, hopefully, doing assessment well, you're going to see that happening along the way. And you're going to adjust on the fly. You're going to be adaptable. You're going to say, okay, if it is important, if what this program is trying to achieve is essential to success in this context, we need to fix this problem. So we either need to give this up because we're not going to be able to succeed because someone else is interrupting one of our decisional nodes, or we need to find a way to remove that disruption. So that's again, you don't want to wait until the end and go, oh, but if you did wait until the end and say, okay, we failed because of this, at least that's a learning moment. I think Congress would be more, as long as that wasn't routine, would be willing to accept that as, okay, we had a good validated program. Despite significant adversary efforts to change behaviors in the direction opposite what we were trying to do, we managed to hold behavior even. And going forward, we're going to try to find ways to increase our efforts to either overwhelm what they're doing or find something else to do to remove that disruption. It's all about how you present it. At the congressional oversight level, they need to continue to demand accountability, but they need to be clearer about what they want. So there's some vagueness coming down in the congressional requirement because of this lack of shared understanding. So many of the folks in the DoD side that I talked to said it felt a little bit like a rock drill, where they'd bring a rock up to Congress and go, here's a rock. And Congress would go, that's not the right rock. And then they'd go away, and the next quarter they'd come back and say, here's a rock. And Congress would go, well, that's a nice rock, but that's not the right rock. So there's need for a little more clarity in that regard. And they need to balance expectations. They need to recognize that there's this lack of shared understanding, so that there's not going to be a single standard metric with which we can compare an influence operation, an aircraft carrier, and a squadron of tanks. It's just not, that doesn't happen. So we need to come up with something else. Yeah.
So given that in a situation where there's something like a counterinsurgency, where the political attitudes affect behavior, and you have things where military action is designed to affect politics, and you have a continuum and a serious connection between them. Do you don't think there would be an ability to say X amount of money spent on IIP would be equivalent to X amount of money spent on infantry battalions, would be equivalent to X amount of money spent on SOF? Given if this is assuming that, of course, that we had done the requisite amount of assessment over the time to get those backgrounds that
You get different things from each of those tools.
That's exactly the point. That the problem is an accurate theory of change would say you're getting something from all of those things. So there is some question about the balance, and you need a really careful assessment design to help you figure out what the right balance is. But no sensible person thinks you're going to talk your way out of an insurgency, that you can just inform, influence, and persuade your way out of that. Some people have to get schwacked. And complicating things is the fact that all the kinetic things you're doing also send messages. But my favorite saying in that regard is, if a picture is worth 1,000 words, then a JDAM is worth 10,000. You can literally blow up a lot of good influence efforts with one errant round or one mistaken ray.
You can influence a whole lot with the one round.
Right. So that needs to be considered an influence effort.
I guess that would be the problem for me, is that right now we're seeing it as such a different topic from SOF, from tanks, from infantry, and really it's like PSYOP or influence activities should not be a separate topic. It is essentially the glue that gets it all together to get to our objective. However, we are being held accountable on a completely different
So,
range of positions.
Go ahead.
a couple of hypothetical points here is some of your greater IO operations happen at a COCOM level and they're compartmentalized. Now, is your audience, and was this written for an audience of DoD or Congress?
Both.
Okay, so is your audience that wants the assessments to match against dollars, are they cleared at the SCI level?
I think some of the congressional committees take stuff at that level, yes. Or we might be able
Staffers
to.
that are going through the numbers?
Beg pardon?
Are the staffers that are going to grind through the numbers, will they do?
Well, that's one of the other issues in this is what they actually want to see. They want to see 1 page per program.
Okay.
And so that's the kind of standardization they want.
And that's part of the challenge you've got.
It is.
The other one goes to what I said earlier, you getting covered was best practices for gathering information in several time zones and languages away. Because you can have the best framework, you've got a beautiful framework, probably the best I've ever seen, but it doesn't mean anything if you're trying to do a survey in 06 in Iraq, and you want to know if your effect-based based operations is working, whether you're using kinetic or IO. How do you collect that information? It was very problematic.
Sure.
And so if in your writings, you can get, at least if it's just a classified arena, called collaborations between those who've had success stories, that would be a big, big deal.
Yeah, there's a big discussion in here about the value of narratives in assessment. And
Narrative is a hard thing.
it is, and how to do that well and do
Because
that better.
getting anecdotal bits was never a problem. It's providing the quantitative information you keep coming back to. That's been the problem.
To make the foundation. So I urge you all to use the web pages and look at, whoops. You can contact me or find the studies on the web and download them. I thank you for your time and attention.